You know all about that. Take away our energy, if you can believe it. No fossil fuel. Destroy our Second Amendment, attack the right to life, and replace American freedom with left-wing fascism. Left-wing. We're going left-wing all the way. Fascists. They are fascists. Some of them. Not all of them, but some of them. But they're getting closer and closer. We have to win this election. But the proud people of Minnesota will not let this happen.
Yes, the great people of Minnesota have failed me. Welcome, folks. Left Reckoning, episode 83 on MetLife with David Grissom. Hello, David.
Hey, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm doing pretty good, I must say, despite, the left-wing fascism.
And the failure of Minnesota. They failed bigly.
He did say in that he will never come to Minnesota again if they don't deliver their electoral votes to him, and they did not. They turned out for Sleepy Joe, despite what you're hearing from a lot of people, which is that the public was against the George Floyd protests, which some people would have you say, but most people actually supported them, even locally. We have a lot to talk about today.
Yeah, we do.
Where should we start?
Just reminding folks that, in a little bit, we're going to talk a bit more about Jackson, Mississippi. We're talking about some lessons from history that I think are really important for people to start to get a little bit of a better understanding of Southern politics, because a lot of the things that you see today, they have been echoed many, many times in the past, and a lot differently than I think a lot of people sort of expect or understand. We'll also going to be talking a bit about the very unfair raid on Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago. This could be a hell of a really interesting chapter for sure.
Yeah, I mean, really, one of the it's funny, you talk about this. I think you mentioned in our talk with Ben Burgess a few weeks ago that this upsets you more than the Jan 6 thing. Definitely. And I'm actually when I thought about that, I'm I think I might disagree with David, because I do think the election lie that is a problem with me. But in terms of flagrant behavior, I mean, it really is hilarious that Trump has been trying to turn Mar-a-Lago, which is not even an official residence. It's some sort of
White House.
Elite. Go look at Mar-a-Lago on video. That place, it's just the hills. It's not hills have eyes. Eyes have eyes wide shut. That's the reference I'm going for. It's just eyes wide shut. The hotel, and that he was keeping just classified documents next to his Time magazines is and things that should be, and this is a principle we talk about with Charles. Those are public records. You don't get to just say these are mine now. Think of the precedent that sets if whoever is just able to smuggle out. I mean, there are, frankly, the redaction process. Taking it from somebody who used to go through the Nixon tapes, they let you blot out an awful lot of stuff from those records that are even slightly pertaining to your personal life. So anyway, even if that's actually political stuff, but yeah, go ahead, David.
Oh no, I hear you 100%. I was just going to say we're also going to be talking about this really devastating result in Chile, and reminding folks, because we've got a lot of tough stuff to get to, so we need to jump right into it. But to please think about joining up with us for the post game, patreon.com/Left Reckoning. This time, I promise y'all that we will probably be jumping over very, very quickly after the main show. So not a long wait time like usual, because we have a pre-record interview between them, but you get access to that patreon.com/Left Reckoning. But if you're ready, man, I think we should jump into at least the top story. And this is going to be a shorter segment. We'll definitely be doing more on this, but we've already said, I think, what needs to be said for the most part about this. And we're talking about the purposeful murder of Palestinian and American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who was very clearly killed by a member of the Israeli military. And all that you've been hearing from the United States government since then has, frankly, it's been crickets. It's been scuttling things around. I don't know if you have this clip handy, Matt, but some new developments have just happened in this case, and I want to talk about it.
Israel's military has admitted for the first time that Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was likely killed by Israeli gunfire. The Israel Defense Forces released a report on Monday concluding Abu Akleh's death was an accident. She was killed in May while she was covering an Israeli military operation in the West Bank. The IDF says there's a high possibility they are responsible. They don't, though, intend to pursue criminal charges against the soldier responsible. In a statement, the military said the soldiers did not know they were firing at the press and thought they were firing back at militants. Evidence, though, from a CNN investigation in May revealed there was no active combat or Palestinian militants near where Abu Akleh was standing. She was also wearing a vest identifying her as press, both on her front and on her back. Abu Akleh's family slamming the IDF report Monday, saying it, quote, tried to obscure the truth and avoid responsibility, and now they're calling for an independent U.S. investigation. Joining us now is...
So we're starting this show up with this story for one very specific reason. In addition to, the humanity of this person who was murdered by the state so easily and without thought, right? Because for members of the Israeli military, life is cheap and you can do whatever the hell you want for the most part. We're bringing this up and talking about this at the front because when this happened, there was a lot of outrage, rightful outrage and frustration, and it was a major international incident. But what you got from the Biden administration was a lot of running around saying, well, we're not going to say nothing until we actually have the facts, until Israel is able to do their report. And I'll tell you all right now, folks, like I said at the time, the one reason that they did that is because they want people to forget. They hope that by continuing to push this back, that outrage will dissipate, and that the demands that they do something about this apartheid state that is now not only willingly killing Palestinian people, but is also killing American citizens, right? And it's not that the act of her being murdered as an American, puts her humanity in a different place. It just goes to show how weak and how willing this government in this country is to excuse the terror of this apartheid state of Israel. That they won't even defend their own citizens abroad when they are the casualties of that said terror. So we wanted to bring that up at the top to remind folks that when the Biden administration said, we're going to do something about it as soon as we get the information, well, there you go. You got some stuff from Israel. Certainly a lot of, we didn't really know what was going on. But undoubtedly at this point, we know who shot who. We knew that initially, and they have no more excuses. And I think it's really important that we don't allow this to sort of go back to the back burner where everyone in the administration is hoping that it goes.
Yeah, I mean, this is just a sort of another instance in how a flagrant apartheid state, acting when it has a client state that's willing to support it. And, I think you compare it, Mandela did, you compare it to South Africa, and South Africa left the Brits behind basically to go with the Nazis. And I'm simplifying a little bit, but you have to realize Israel is being flagrant right now. And it's, I think it's putting people like Biden. It's very interesting to see the type of position, because let me just remind folks what happened. Now that the IDF is admitting, oh yeah, we shot her. This is what the IDF was doing to her funeral. Israeli security forces. This is her casket. Let me mute that. Beating people up as they move her body in. And also remind folks of the 2018 Great March of Return, when the IDF said this on Twitter. They said, yesterday we saw 30,000 people. We arrived prepared and with precise reinforcements. Nothing was carried out uncontrolled. Everything was accurate and measured. We know where every bullet landed. And now we have to have a big, long process to figure out where this bullet landed, where everybody else knows that where the bullet that landed in Shireen Abu Akleh came from an Israeli gun. And yeah, I don't really know what else to say is that, but other than this is how like an extreme like apartheid government, say it again, that has like we have to generalize or rationalize, I should say. We have to rationalize a sort of partnership we have with this with this government. So you finally have even CNN willing to come out. It's been interesting to see who's willing to come out and call it for what it is. CNN saying like we dispute the idea that there was any sort of gunfire in the area, right? And but it's like pulling teeth to get
Totally.
reality acknowledged in this case.
Yeah, and while there was a lot of freak out about Trump being mean to reporters, right? It's like universally condemned by that class. You see something like this that is the most egregious thing you could do to somebody, which is to kill them. And like the attacks on her funeral are just a reminder of what the reality is for Palestinian people. Israel tries everything possible to deny them dignity in life, and also tries to deny them dignity in death. There's been more stories that have come out where new policies wherein if you are to go to the West Bank, and maybe because you know somebody there who you think that you might be in love with, you have to declare that to the Israeli government. And if you do intend to be married, they require that you have, I believe, a 6-month long cooling off period, which is just, again, another insult, another loss of purposeful attempt to make people lose their dignity, all again to placate the apartheid and imperial ambitions of Israel. And it's disgusting. It should have stopped a long ass time ago. And I think this kind of runaround that the Biden administration and the Democratic Party are very complicit in absolutely needs to stop. So we want to make sure that we were upping that at the top of this program, because they're doing everything that they can to bury this story.
And you see more and more of this. I saw Jagmeet Singh getting attacked over being anti-Semitic or infantilizing Palestinians with some sort of vaguely pro-Palestinian stance he had. You see the effect of sort of the anti-Semite smear on Jeremy Corbyn and what that's done to the Labour Party. This is a huge, huge problem for everyone's politics. And it's because there's a big like problem here that that's been denied by like the fucking State Department for decades.
No doubt about it. Well, we got a bunch of stuff that I think we need to get to, but I think one of the top line stories, and just saying really quick to everyone on a programming note, if there's something that we aren't able to cover on this program, it's not because we don't think that it's not important or not serious. I mean, it's just we do have this one Tuesday slot, and we try to fit it as much as we can. So there's some things that we definitely want to be talking about, like the assassination attempt against Kirchner in Argentina, and some of the really worrying developments there. I think we'll talk about that a little bit on Thursday during the Griscom stream. But we wanted to talk a little bit about Chile and this loss for the new constitution in the country, because this was something that we had all put a lot of hope into. You can find clips of Matt and I in 2020 talking about how excited we were about this process and this moment. And we need to talk about where we came from and see where we are now, so that we can start to plot a direction to the future. Now, it's still very fresh. We don't have all the information. There's more analysis that is needed. So, of course, this is going to be incomplete. But just because something is difficult and complicated doesn't mean that we shouldn't wrestle and reckon with some of the contradictions and tensions and try to draw out some lessons. But maybe just to set the stage a little bit, Matt, if you're able, like, could you explain to people what the Pinochet constitution was, why it represented such a cementing of right-wing power? People, I'm sure, who listen to this program are familiar with who Pinochet was, military dictator who came into power after the coup against Allende, who was a Marxist who was popularly elected in Chile. And then you saw this horrific right-wing reaction to a dictatorship that lasted for a very long time, and still has many of its echoes in the current system today. But one of the one that is most notable is the Chilean constitution, which is one of the most right-wing pro-market constitutions in the world. And I think that it is important for people to understand what people rejected from the outset. if we're going to talk about, some new avenues or new potentials for the future.
Yeah, so I'm going to be reading from a book that folks should put in their libraries. It's Democracy in Chains by Nancy McLean, The Deep History of the Radical Right Stealth Plan for America. You'll see, if you Google this book, you'll see a lot of whiny libertarians talk about how it's reductive and over generalizes and maybe over emphasizes the emphasis of certain individuals, or the efforts of certain individuals. But it is a very good history for the rough explanations it does give. And there's a reason the libertarians are so whiny about it, is because a hit dog will holler. Here's from the chapter, A Constitution with Locks and Bolts. So intrinsic was the influence of economic libertarians that Chile's new constitution bore the same name as Hayek's classic The Constitution of Liberty. It promised a democracy, remarked the leading American historian of the Pinochet era, Stephen Stern, protected from too much democracy. The new constitution guaranteed the power of the armed forces over the government in the near term, and over the long term curtailed the group influence of non-elite citizens. The document guaranteed the rule of General Pinochet and his aides until a 1988 plebiscite that might extend his term to 1997, when a new generation, as Stern notes, would have learned the role of the citizen in a restrictive democracy. The devil is in the details, goes the adage, and it is true. The wicked genius of Buchanan's approach to binding popular self-government was, this is Buchanan, is the libertarian that McLean focuses on most in this. In the boring fine print, he understood transformations can be achieved by increments that few will notice, but most people will have no patience for minutiae. But the kind of people he was advising, I'm going to skip a little bit ahead here. Pinochet personally reviewed the penultimate document, making well over 100 changes, then announced that citizens would have to vote a simple yes or no on whether to adopt the new constitution in its entirety, and a plebiscite to be held within a month of release. The balloting would take place during a prolonged state of emergency in which all political parties were outlawed, no voter rolls existed to prevent fraud because the junta had them all burned, and no scrutiny or counting by foreign observers was to be allowed. When a group of moderate jurists and civic leaders composed a truly democratic alternative document, the regime prohibited its release. Censorship. That should get some people's attention, if nothing else does. The mayors charged with running the plebiscite and counting the votes owed their jobs to the dictatorship. So that's how we got the constitution that Chile is trying to replace.
Yeah, and again, this is a document that really enshrines the power of the market, limits the government's ability to do things like nationalize certain industries. A really, really devastating relic of
Right.
authoritarian neoliberalism.
Yeah, I got actually some more on that, David, actually. The net impact of the new constitution's intricate rules changes was to give the president unprecedented power, hobble the Congress, and enable unelected military officials to serve as a power brake on the elected members of Congress. A cunning new electoral system, not used anywhere in the world, would permanently overrepresent the right-wing minority party to ensure a system frozen by elite interests. To seal the elite control, the Constitution forbade union leaders from belonging to political parties and from intervening in activities alien to their specific goals, defined solely as negotiating wages and hours in their particular workplaces. It also barred advocating class conflict or attacking the family. Anyone deemed anti-family or Marxist could be sent into exile without access to an appeal process.
So, and reminding folks, because I know everybody comes into these conversations with different understandings of history, this is a, military, U.S.-backed reaction to organized socialist movements that were able to win popular power in the country that was then toppled and replaced with a military dictatorship. So all those kind of like anti-public, anti-political aspects of the drafting of that constitution were very much set up to make sure that people are as far away from the drafting of their constitution as possible. But fast forward to today, or to recent history, since then, obviously Pinochet is deposed. The country, though, spends years and years and years effectively being controlled by right-wingers. And it has led to a country that is highly unequal, a country where there is mass dissatisfaction with government. And in 2019, there is sparked this massive social protest movement, one that we covered a hell of a lot on TMBS, that was really challenging the austerity and the neoliberal character of the government in Chile. In 2019, there's this massive protest movement that then embodies itself in this 2020 vote to scrap the Pinochet constitution. And I'm just going to play a couple seconds just to remind people who might have forgotten how jubilant and enthusiastic that moment was. This is from 2020 when the Constitution, when people voted to scrap the Constitution. I mean, it was massive partying, in the streets. People were very excited, and particularly the international left was very excited about this moment. One of the popular slogans of the rejection, the vote to scrap the initial constitution, was "Neoliberalism was born here, and it will die here." Right? There is no banner that can speak more to the heart of somebody who holds our politics than something like that. And then since then. A leftist, and it's important to note here, not necessarily of the socialist, more communist side of Chilean politics, Boris is able to win the presidency. And during this period of time, the convention is ongoing to rewrite and draft a new constitution for the country. And then this weekend, this happened.
Opponents of Chile's new proposed constitution never dreamed they'd win Sunday's referendum by such a wide margin. Some toasted the victory. Others honked their horns, convinced that the charter would have fanned divisions and instability.
I think the majority of us want a new constitution, and that must be respected, but it has to be done properly, with capable people.
Supporters of the proposed text insist it was progressive and cutting edge. It guaranteed gender parity, social rights to all, allowed abortion and protection of the environment. Yet many others believe it went too far, for instance, by recognizing Chilean indigenous groups as individual nations.
Some people, even from the center-left, that are voting rechazo or rejection of this text is because they fear that Chile will be dismembered somehow.
Voting in this referendum was mandatory, but that's not the only reason why this vote will likely be remembered as the one with the highest citizen participation in Chilean history so far. It's an indication of just how much Chileans believe that a new constitution has the possibility of changing their lives, for better or for worse. Humbled by the electoral defeat, left-wing President Gabriel Boric acknowledged that the proposal he'd supported was not what the people wanted.
I promise that I will do all I can, together with Congress and members of civil society, to present a new constitutional calendar, using the lessons of this process to deliver a new text that will interpret the will of the people.
The referendum has dealt a strong blow to the president, whom many blame for a rise in inflation and crime. People such as Cecilia, who voted against the Constitution.
To be honest, I did not read it.
Now the process starts all over again, prolonging uncertainty in a country that needs social and economic change, but can't agree on how much. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Santiago.
And again, the vote was 62% against and something like 38% for. Now, how did we get here? And just trying to catch everybody up. If you don't spend a lot of time reading, left media, particularly on the international scene, people really saw this constitution as the embodiment of many, many of goals that are held by progressives and the left more broadly. It was certainly a maximalist constitution. It was one that very much embodied a lot of these things that we consider to be rights and at least to be necessary political goals that are achieved. And again, we're at a moment right now where I think it's important not to overstep our analysis, but I also think it is mighty cowardly not to talk about some of the things that went wrong, especially when the right wing is going to be very, very happy to frame this in a certain way. So how did we get here? There's been a lot of talk about what happened, and one of the most dominant conversations that you're going to get from people on the left or even the center left is about, quote unquote, fake news. And I'm just going to stop it right there. I'm not saying that's not a problem. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm not even saying it's not influential. But this is one of those things where you can't just sort of sit and say like, oh, well, the media is against us, um, and act as if like that is enough. Well, then like why are we playing, right? That also is a very easy way to sort of reject any kind of attempts to learn from negative results like this. And this was a negative result. I mean, this was a huge setback of a years-long process, one that had its roots in decades-long opposition and pushback to the right-wing government and the military dictatorship. So yeah, no doubt people are going to be talking about fake news, but I think that's a very, very simplistic way to look at politics. And it's also one that doesn't give us any kind of avenues for trying to figure out ways to beat it. Because you can say that there's a lot of fake news or misinformation out there, but then you're still going to be left with the same question. Well, how do we beat it? And the only way to beat something like that is to be able to provide and present a much stronger, much more reality-based counter narrative. Right? The reason the right wing is so committed to using disinformation is because they don't have very, very much positive to stand on. So they have to sort of stoke fears and play this game.
Also, not a new strategy for them. So it's not something that, like, especially just capital and even liberal capitalism, making it up as they go along. Like, this is tried and true, right? Like, it's honestly like the playing field's as favorable as it's ever been with regards to misinformation. Maybe that's too categorical of a statement, but like the capitalists have controlled media. Right, like that's a thing that's happened, and the technology's changed a little bit to be a little bit more inclusive. But it, like you said, like this is the race we're trying to run.
Mm-hmm. And like I don't know, it just reminds me of something that Varoufakis said to Haddad when he was in New York after losing to Bolsonaro, where he was blaming fake news and Pentecostalism, and Varoufakis, I think, had a very good response to that, which is like, we're the left. We actually can't be the people who are losing in technology. And again, it's not saying these things aren't happening. It's not saying that these things aren't things we should take seriously. But this is one of those kind of excuses that becomes all too easy and becomes way too dominant, and misses a lot, because there were problems with the drafting of this Constitution, as we'll talk about in a little bit. I don't know if you have this handy, Matt, but like here's how the right's trying to frame, this rejection. This is in the FT, our favorite paper. Chile's rejection of populism is an example for the world. In Sunday's constitutional referendum, voters spurned a flawed vision of utopia. Populism has cast a particularly long shadow in Latin America. Crowd-pleasing orators proclaiming a new utopia pepper its recent history. I don't know how much I need to take you all through all of that, but you know where this argument is going. In this unpromising landscape, Chile's decision in a referendum on Sunday to reject decisively an impossibly utopian constitution stands out as a remarkable example of civic maturity. This is a setback for left-wing President Boric, the former student protest leader who had staked much political capital on the now rejected radical draft. Voters were almost literally promised the earth. The draft would have granted constitutional rights to nature. Attractive-looking carrots abounded among the 388 articles drawn up by a specially elected assembly after a year of sometimes raucous debate. So that's how the right is going to try to frame this. This is why left-wing politics don't work. This is why appealing to the people doesn't work. We have to be grounded in reality, which means a very, very pro-market, conservative outlook on politics. But again, as I was saying earlier, I think a lot of the left-wing reactions to this have been equally unsatisfactory for trying to figure out why this vote failed. I highly suggest, and if you just put up the title for a second, Matt, I highly suggest people read the piece, translated roughly into "Where did the support for the Chilean constituent process go?" By Noah Titleman, if you're able to find a way to read that. And he outlines...
Yeah, it's on Nueva Sociedad.
Thank you. He outlines three particular reasons. One was the spectacle of the convention. And, for some people, they might know this. For some people who aren't familiar, they might not. People were elected to be in this convention, and there was a lot of spectacle aspects, and we'll get into some of the reasons why. But, from costumes to grand pronouncements and denunciations of certain groups, I mean, there was a kind of spectacle, performative nature to this whole process. There was also a very clear overrepresentation. This is what Titleman argues. There's an overrepresentation of the left that was not necessarily in line with the social base of the country. And three, he also, I think something that a lot of lefties would agree with, notes that there was a reaction of dominant groups in Chile to marginalized groups, most notably on the question of plurinationalism, with multi-nation system, and largely independent indigenous court systems, which a lot of people rejected, many of them for more conservative reactionary reasons, but others for different ones, right? And it's worth noting, and this gets into the defeat, that you have to remember that the vote to scrap the Constitution initially in Chile was a rejection of the political system as a whole. And remember, just like in the United States, when you see people sort of saying, I'm rejecting politics in this country, I'm rejecting the elite, that can have a hell of a lot of different kind of connotations. And sometimes misrecognizing that as, oh, these people are sort of aligned with us, is a little bit of a mistake. So it was a rejection of not just the Constitution, but the political system in Chile, and most notably the major parties in the country. To draft the Constitution, there was a People's Assembly that had mandated gender parity and indigenous representation. Non-party candidates were able to coalesce together to be voted for in blocks. And the right was not very well represented. They lost their elections, right? And losers there, sure. But when this gets brought back to the people, there becomes a tension here. The right was very underrepresented, and independents, and what I mean by this, as in non-affiliated with a party, though the vast majority of them were left-leaning, were highly represented. And the convention there was a lot of it that was spectacle. There was a lot of activisty aspects to it. Costumes. There were people who were nude in certain votes. I mean, things like that certainly turned off average folks. And there were also very serious maximalist and performative demands that were put forward, even on things that were scrapped. It just felt, the argument is that it felt to a lot of people that this wasn't representative of the people of Chile, rather than a very mobilized group of folks. It's worth remembering, too, that the looseness of political parties and party identification have waned dramatically in Chile. The performative nature of the convention made it seem like these drafters were just as out of touch with the people as politicians. And it also doesn't help. This is tension, right? This is dialectics, because Boric, the president, had run so closely with this new constitution. There's also an aspect here that a vote against the Constitution is a vote of dissatisfaction with the current government. Polling has shown, though, that the most unpopular aspect of the Constitution by groups like Espacio Publico, Ipsos, some of the most unpopular aspects of the Constitution was the plurinational state, particularly the creation of indigenous justice systems. And there were lots of attempts to try to work around that, potentially allowing the Supreme Court to overrule these systems. But this was something that was a real sticking point when people were asked what their opinion was on the Constitution. And it's something we have to reckon with. In the campaign, the vote was sort of, in the campaign for voting yes or no on the Constitution, political parties did reemerge. You saw the traditional parties of the left align more with for the Constitution, and the conservatives against. So remembering all of the factors that go into this, you see this popular uprising against the system. You see this new kind of attempt at democracy to sort of create a people's assembly to draft a new Constitution. So a lot of it based on this kind of rejection of party politics. It then gets brought into party politics when it comes time for this vote. It's also very notable, too, so that we get this right as Marxists, that rejection was strong across class basis. I'll say that again. Rejection was strong across class basis. So you can't sit here and say rich people went one way, poor people went another, right? There are lines here, some went further than others, but across the board, and if you look at the economic data, people rejected this from across different kind of class categories in society. A poll that was also cited in that piece by Noah Titleman, which was done by Kadam, found that 17% of the respondents declared themselves in favor of rejecting the Constitution in its entirety. 35% rejected it with the intention, were in favor of rejecting it with the intention to restart the process. 32% of Chileans said that they would have been voting to approve, to reform the Constitution after the fact, that is, after it had already gone into place, and only 12% approving outright.
Right.
So there's some key lessons here, right? One, rejecting outright only got 17% of the vote. So there is popular demand here for a new constitution in the country, and that process is going to be underway, and we'll have more on that as it gets developed. So the question that the left has is how to reform those who want a new constitution, how to form those who want a new constitution into a majority. Very likely there's going to be a fast-tracked attempt to redraft this constitution. So what should we do and what should we learn? We could talk about the spectacle nature. We can talk about some of the kind of symbolic aspects of politics that might have turned off, the average voter, right? I think that's important, but I think that that's also more of a question for people in Chile.
And I'd also say that can't be the 25% loss, right? Like just that stuff isn't gonna make you get walloped by that much.
Certainly. And like, this is the point, is like, this is why a lot of people have avoided wanting to talk about it, because there's a lot of different factors in play. And this isn't the final analysis of this. But I also think it's very dangerous to say we're going to reject, like really trying to look here and to see what kind of tensions were going on, because this matters not just for people in Chile. This matters for us across the globe as we're trying to find ways to get our message and our ideas into practice rather than just sort of sitting on our bookshelves in the realm of theory. So this is not about wagging the finger, but without a doubt, it shows that the only real way to win is through organization and building class consciousness. That's sort of it. Like it could just end there. There's no shortcut around politics. And this is not me sitting here saying that people who are involved in this process, people who are advocating for this new constitution, which is something that I supported. I had some issues with some parts of it, but I generally supported. It's not saying that people involved in it weren't considering this either, right? In the same way that people in our country, when we were trying to elect Bernie Sanders, all knew that we needed real organization. We didn't have it, and we tried to find a way to do it without it. This is just another one of these hard lessons that the left on a global level is learning, is that like you just can't fast track that process of building class organization, of building class consciousness. But it also brings in a tension that I think really does exist on the left. Not just in Chile, but you think about here, where it's just like this fetishization of spontaneity, right? Because in the days as it was going on, as the initial vote happened, and then as the Constitutional Convention was sort of unrolling, you had all this, well, this is wonderful. There's spontaneity. There's all these different groups, and they might not all agree, but maybe we'll get something positive out of this, right? And that was oftentimes cited as a positive thing. Like, this is the expression of the people in a myriad of different ways. And as you see from some of the rejection of, some of the aspects of spontaneity that went into the People's Assembly there, spontaneity can have a real negative effect. You won't be able to skip the social process of challenging and educating people on the embeddedness of some conservative elements in our politics and our ideology. And we also really need to be careful about confusing maximalism with socialism, or even with the more squishy concept of leftism. These are not the same things. And it's really damn important that we get this right, because there are demands that we have. There are ideas that we have for the society that we want to be living in. But we have to remember that politics, and particularly socialism, is a process. It's not just like a one set of like clearly outlined policies that we just enact day one, done, right?
Yeah.
The
way I think about that is like it's something we have to like cultivate, especially through state policy, and it's not something that all of a sudden we just turn the state into, right?
I totally agree, and like cultivating is the word, right? Like the goal of like socialist politics and policy more than anything is actually creating like that space and that environment where working class people, class consciousness, these kind of class rooted, embedded organizations and consciousnesses can truly thrive and grow. But here's the other thing that we really cannot do, right? Because I think some people were mad for what I've said just then, but there's this other group that's also extremely dangerous too. The other thing we cannot do is be reactionary, right? Oh, this or that was rejected by the people, so we should drop it outright, right? Gender positive like gender politics in Chile were rejected, so drop that from the left, right? We need to just do a hard nose, wages up, capitalists down, only politics, right? No social aspects to it. We're going to drop that. That is reactionary, and that is also the wrong analysis. Don't put your head in the sand and refuse to recognize that some things are not popular at this moment, and also that some things are not well thought out in their implication and and putting them into practice. But also don't solely react to this or that and over determine and essentialize people and essentialize things, right? Because all of these fights, particularly in the social arena, are processes. It doesn't mean it needs to take 15, 20 years. It doesn't mean it needs to take generations, but these are things that these battles, they need to be rooted in a movement that can get the victories that are necessary to get the kind of final victory that we want. Politics is a process. It's chaotic, and it's our job as socialists to see where people are, but also be committed to the ideas, um, and the belief that we can move people over to our side. So just because it's not there today doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for tomorrow. And there were some very laudable things in the Constitution that was proposed, and there were a lot of others that felt very much premature. We also have to be recognized that we must be rooted in organization, because the idea that spontaneity is going to be able to win it, that spontaneity has the long-term outlook necessary, the energy necessary of doing the things that we want to do, is wrong. It's tough. I'm sorry. But we have to organize class-rooted movements and not just hope that circumstantial, eclectic coalitions are going to be able to sustain the ongoing and coming right-wing attacks. There's going to be a lot more to see what the movement next is going to be. I think one thing that's really important to reject and to start pushing back against is the idea that, okay, well, this Constitution was too far, was too progressive, all this, so we should draw all of it back, that we shouldn't try to get victories and cement certain things. That's where the fight is going to be, because there's going to be a big push to say, like, Constitution was too crazy, we're just going to take on like a slightly less conservative version of, a typical Constitution in other South American countries, right? That's where the fight is going to be coming up. And we need to really reject that kind of idea. Say, okay, the kind of maximalist, super progressive, 388 article Constitution might not be something that's viable in the short term, but also don't overreact and say we need to draw this all back completely. I'm looking forward to talking to friends and people who are actively organizing and pushing on this. But I think that, as somebody who was a big supporter of this process, who had a lot of hope for it, and has been very devastated by this defeat, I think it's really important to be sober-eyed about some of the lessons here. Don't become a reactionary, but also don't become so starry-eyed that you can't see where some politics and some strategies failed.
And I would just emphasize, these things haven't been done before, right? Like the American Constitution was written. Well, we just went over how the last Chilean Constitution was implemented. The American one was just a bunch of slave owners and some northern merchants, right? Like that got together, and they were only able to agree on less clauses than that. So just this is uncharted territory, and it's not as it's. I don't think it should be. Anyone should be sort of shamed for pushing this for as maximalist as it can. But you have to understand that is a strategy. And does that strategy deliver the goods, as far as trying to cultivate a world where regular people have a little bit more power on their side? And maybe pare it back, because it's, like you said, it's a lot easier when you're just a few fancy boys who own slave plantations in Virginia.
Exactly. And last thing I'll say on this before we move on is, I'm a socialist. I'm a Marxist. I'm not a progressive. I'm not a leftist. I think that those terms are very squishy. I don't know what people mean when they say these things. And I think some of the lessons that we've been learning on, people might have seen, we did part 1 of our documentary on what was left populism. Part 2 is ongoing. Hopefully be out in the next couple of weeks. I think what we've learned from this chapter of left populist politics is that there is a promise, an initial kind of mobilization that could come around some of these ideas that were sort of put forward in left populism. But unfortunately, we've seen that those don't have the long-term resiliency and the ability to commit people for a prolonged period of time, to think strategically into the future, to be able to deliver in the way that we desperately, desperately need. But there'd be much more on all of that in the future. And yeah, we'll definitely be covering this more. I definitely am looking forward to getting some more folks on to sort of help us understand, particularly people who are more familiar with the political and social landscape in Chile, who have more experience with this, and particularly people who are working on plans, to make sure that this defeat doesn't end in a total defeat. That there's a victory that is very close and on the horizon. So much
And
more.
you pointed out like the type of there was like people who want a new constitution but rejected it, and people who thought like this one wasn't really it but still approved it anyway. That was what, 2/3 of
Yeah.
Chileans, right? Like that's really the lesson here, is like the right will run with it because that's what they do. They try to take advantage of things where they can try to declare victories, but this is definitely not that. And time only is moving forward, I think, in this regard. Like, I mean, it would, let's just say this: the worst case scenario is somehow the right is able to exploit this and turn their 17% or wherever the fuck into, let's just go back to Pinochet. But I think we should have a little bit more faith in Chileans than
I
expect
think
that's
people
going to
should have
happen.
a lot of faith. I mean, there is no doubt about it that there's a desire for a new constitution in the country, a popular one, and we need to just be able to find ways to write it. I mean, like, we might not clip this because this is just like a general point, but I think I was saying this to you, Matt, or somebody else. It drives me nuts whenever something like this happens, right? Both defeat and victory, where people overdetermine results. Like, with this election, people voted this way, and this election, people voted, differently. Like, in Austin, for example, there was like an attempt to radically slash the police budget in the city, and it won by like a pretty wide margin. Very soon after, there was another public vote that criminalized homeless people in a way that is so draconian and so anti-human. And sometimes it's hard to walk around and remember that folks, were voting for that kind of thing. I bring that up to say it's like you can't say one of these things is more determinate permanently than the other, right? Like, we have to do analysis. We need to look at things and learn lessons from them. But this kind of desire to say, like, oh, that's the final vote. Now this question is settled. This is the final vote. Now this question is settled. You need to be looking at things from a much longer perspective, right? And the attempt to redraw and redraft the Constitution, Chile is part of not only like a long process in Chile, but a part of like a long-term global kind of left populist social progressive movement to really fundamentally change the way that people are treated in countries, not just Chile, but across the globe, right? And we need to learn some of the lessons and failures here. And I just really get frustrated when something like this happens and people say, like, this is, the final analysis of this. It's like, I think it's
Right.
very important to draw lessons from it. I think that it's also important to be able to stand up on your own 2 feet a little bit and not say, like, well, it's all complex, so I'm not going to have any opinion on these things. But this other kind of like very quick reaction to be like, all right, that question's settled, right? People feel one way about this permanently. I
Right.
think is wrong as well.
Right, it's exactly, like, history's too complex for that sort of thing, right? Like, it's like you read a book on Gettysburg, and all of a sudden everything is described by Gettysburg. It's like,
Yeah.
no, that's not really how it works. Like, yeah, absolutely.
Well, let's move on a little bit closer to home, and we're going to go back to Jackson, Mississippi. Where this crisis is still ongoing. I mean, before we get to the Lumumba speech, Matt, do you have that image of the truck?
I have actually, better than the image
Oh,
of the truck. I
you
have
got
the
some footage.
TikTok.
Just put this up for a second because this is one of those things that's important to remember. We don't all live in the same society. A lot of us are much more affected than these things than others, and I think this video really highlights this. So again, wait, just really quick, sorry, before you even go any further, in case you haven't seen, in Jackson, Mississippi, there has been a water crisis where people aren't able to get any.
I was trying to stop that from happening.
Okay. Any clean water in the city. This is a process that has been going on. The crisis is something that happened recently, but it has been sort of boiling over for a very long time. In fact, Jackson was on a boil water notice before this kind of critical failure in their water system. And as listeners of Left Reckoning know, they had a very similar shutdown of the system back in 2021 as well, right? These things are not sort of isolated and just like, oh, accident of history, accident of nature. This happened. Like, no, these are human-made problems. And we already talked about many of the reasons why. So if people are watching this for the first time, there's another video that you can watch called can't drink the water. You can watch for more analysis of this, but we want to talk about a little bit of the fallout here. Anyway, sorry, long-winded, but yeah, watch this for a second because this is pretty striking.
And we'll just try to roll through it there, but I'll just read the text. This is in front of Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves' mansion in Mississippi. It's his own personal water truck. Meanwhile, Jackson does not have water to drink, cook, bathe, or flush their toilets. There's the governor's mansion right there. Ooh, nice little gazebo.
So when the residents of Jackson are having to make decisions about how much water they can allocate to flushing their toilet or for cooking food or drinking, this boy's getting water delivered to him by the truckload, which is a big reminder of the class society that we live in. But I know you have this clip of Lumumba, and I think that sort of sets us up well to start talking about this a little bit more.
Yeah, this is cited in an article by the Mississippi Free Press about the Tate Reeves comments on privatization, and it's basically Lumumba describing the types of, I guess you'd call it, public-private partnerships that he's willing to accept with regards to maintenance for the system. And we'll play it now, but it really underlines just the paralysis of to act in a capacity that is needed by like just local city governments, right? Like there's the options for the mayor here aren't great. But anyway, here's what he's had to say.
What we are willing to do is the potential of a maintenance agreement, an agreement that helps augment staffing, helps augment the regular O&M that has to happen right here at the water treatment facilities. We're open to that, right? To the end of looking at our staffing shortages. Because we have such a multitude of challenges, it further amplifies the staff shortage. The fact that you don't have people that could be present for anything that can go out at any particular point in time helps underscore the staff shortages that we have. Now, that is a common thing, unfortunately, and we're not in the position that other water treatment facilities are nationally. We took the EPA's advice and the State Department of Health's advice in getting a part of the Rural Water Association and the mutual aid agreement, which provides between different cities support where they need it. We were eagerly anticipating the arrival of some professionals, some water operating professionals from Orlando, Florida. And when it was on the eve of them coming, they shared that they had their own staffing challenges and that they could no longer come. And so we looked at that as a short-term solution. Hopefully we're able to find somebody in the network, but until that happens, we are going to be tasking out for contractual relationships some of the work that has to happen on a routine basis.
There's so much to get into, but I think that last bit does really highlight something about the water crisis, is that it's aggravated by a lot of factors in Jackson, Mississippi that we've talked about, and we're going to talk about a little bit more in a moment. But as Matt, you just experienced, it's not a certain thing in most places in this country that the water that you're going to get from your public taps is safe.
Yeah, actually, I went down. I took the train to Baltimore for the first time, visit that city over the weekend. And as I was returning on the train, I noticed that they were under their own boil advisory for, I think, E. coli was. Large parts of the city there. It wasn't part of the city I was in. But I mean, that's the thing, right? Like, and go back to the mayor's speech. When people talk about states' rights, right-wing folks talk about like, oh, different states, different sort of innovative ideas, and will compete towards things. What else would it look like but that? Right? Like that's what it looks like when every sort of municipality is fending for their own public works. And certain ones are going to fail particularly because of structural things to do with how we allocate resources in America. And that's just how, like, it's just, we're talking about staffing shortages to get water to people. Like, how clear is it that we don't have priorities set in this country?
No, I mean, that we don't have a functioning society at this point. I mean, like, the fact is that obviously it gets worse when you boil in all of these other factors like you have in Jackson, Mississippi. But the water crisis in this country has been a long rolling problem. And there has to be serious federal investment, much more than what has been promised by the Biden administration on this. And not only that, it needs to be directed at the federal level, to really be making sure that you're able to get over all of the different peculiarities of different political jurisdictions in this country. If it is like old South stuff that you have to overcome, or hyper privatization like you see out in the West and in the North, right? Like those are factors that exist almost everywhere. There are hurdles to a very, very basic function of a society, which is being able to provide clean and safe drinking water to people. But let's go a little bit closer to this fella Tate Reeves, because I think I wanted to make a few points here. Again, if people want to get a more in-depth look at the crisis there, what caused it, what can be done about it, I do suggest you watch last week's episode where we talked about it in depth. But I want to look at Tate Reeves a little bit to show something about him that I think really does highlight a kind of fundamental fact of Southern politics that I think a lot of people, particularly people from outside the South, but also even a lot of Southerners who might not know their history all the way through, might miss as well. But we have this first clip here, and let's get into it a bit.
What went wrong? Why is Jackson, your state capital, in this extraordinary position?
Well, what I would tell you is, and I know that you in the press really want to play the blame game, and you really want to focus on pitting different people against one another, and that's certainly your priority. That's fine. What we are focused on is the immediate health and welfare of Jackson residents. It's the reason that we have 600 National Guardsmen that have been activated to hand out bottled water. It's the reason that we have tankers running throughout the city to have so that we can say that we have both potable and non-potable water available to the residents of the city of Jackson.
Oh, you're muted, David.
So you see their like very classic kind of Trumpist play. Oh, I'm going to blame the media for this very clear crisis. I bring this up. I promise it will all make sense in a second. That I remember I made some analysis just personally before I was doing any of this when Trump was first, coming into prominence in politics. I'm saying Southerners are never going to accept as their boy, as their guy, a very clear like New York socialite, rich fella. And one, that was incorrect analysis, and two, I should have been hitting the books a little bit and remembering some of Southern history, because there is a long history of rich people from the Northeast coming into the South and dominating politics, and most importantly, dominating industry to the detriment of the people as a whole. People probably have heard this story, and if you haven't prepped this Favre story, where there has been this huge scandal that has been going on actually for a very long time. But I think because of the water crisis in Jackson, I think more and more people are paying attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's this scandal with Brett Favre and many other people too. It's not just him, who were basically, the government was paying out money that was supposed to go to needy folks to sort of line the pockets of people like Favre. This is from the Mississippi Free Press by Ashton Pittman. FBI interviewed Brett Favre in temporary assistance to needy families probe. The FBI has interviewed retired NFL quarterback Brett Favre regarding the Mississippi welfare scandal that saw over $77 million in temporary assistance for needy families fund doled out to fund pet projects and sports celebrities, including Favre himself. NBC News reported Thursday night that Favre's attorney confirmed the FBI's involvement. And what we're getting from Favre is like, I didn't know that they were taking money away from needy people. Basically, for people who don't know what happened, the government of Mississippi was paying people like Favre to like deliver speeches and public appearances to folks, and paying him astronomical amounts from those funds instead of giving them to people. It's noted a bit later in the piece that Mississippi has the highest poverty rate of any state in the country, despite that MDHS data shows that the state yearly rejects more than 90% of poor Mississippians who apply for TANF assistance. In the past year, just 2,500 children received temporary assistance for needy families out of approximately 192,000 people who live in poverty. Right, so there's been a very clear pilfering of this kind of public good. And I just want to say at the top that this is one of those things that always infuriates me when you hear Yankee liberals go on about how much money goes to red states. Because the money that you're talking about that goes from your federal taxes to those states is literally stuff like this. It's trying to provide assistance for people, and I totally agree. If your argument is that this is why we need the federal government to be stepping in and making sure that those funds are being utilized and provided for people, but I have to say that I don't think that that's the point that a lot of those people are making. I bring all of this up, and let's just play this last clip to make a historical point about Southern politics, particularly of the Republican variety, when it comes to these kind of social programs and federal money, and how a lot of the relics of the past history of the South really are at play here. We just played this Reeves clip. He's talking about the water system here, and let's see what he wants to do with the crisis as we have seen their inability to provide water for people.
Second question, if you would be supportive of any privatization efforts of the Jackson water system. You've talked about your concerns about the management from the city.
I'm open to all options. Privatization is on the table. Having a commission that oversees failed water systems, as they have in many states, is on the table. So again, I'm open to ideas. I'm open to conversation. I'm open to discussion. I don't go into those conversations lightly.
Sorry, dude.
It's okay. So there you have it. And again, for people who've been watching our coverage of this, you know that purposefully by Reeves and other members of the Republican Party in Mississippi, they have been waging war on this public good, right? So it's one of those things where you create a crisis through years of underfunding, including holding back federal money to fix these systems, before a big crisis like this happens, to then say, well, we need his daddy market to come in and save the day. Now, I know that seems a bit like, traditional GOP politics. It certainly is a mainstay of their ideology. But I bring all this up from his saying that he would be very willing to bring to entertain privatization schemes for the water system there, to the games that they were playing with Brett Favre under the previous administration in Mississippi. So this is actually an old game in Southern politics. I don't know if you know this term, Matt. Do you know who the Redeemers were in the South?
Nope.
So this is, I think most people know about what Reconstruction was. So after the Civil War, you have this period of time where access to voting is greatly expanded, and you start to see Black people being able to vote, and you see these Republican administrations in states across the South. Oftentimes, this is misremembered as a period that went on for a long period of time. In many states, it lasted only a few years before the Democrats were able to come back into power and take back those states. And those people are called the Redeemers.
Redeeming white supremacy, basically.
Certainly, and industry and capital. But it's important to remember, as Marx has said, like there's a class distinction here with the Redeemers. The Redeemers were not necessarily all the embodiment of the old defeated planter class. The Redeemers like to present themselves as inheritors of this, right? They like to do the kind of lost cause mythology and symbolism, but they actually represented a very different part of Southern class politics, predominantly those of the middle and upper middle class and industry. And after the Civil War, you have an entire region of the country that is completely decimated by the war. Reconstruction did not go far enough. Reconstruction was a process that was ended very, very quickly with a lot of willingness, by the way, from Congress and even from and from the North, because there was a lot of money to be made in the South. A hell of a lot of money, both from the destruction of the war and the kind of general economic position of that part of the country, but because the Southern system was so not just reactionary, but backwards, right? It was backwards in the sense that a planner economy is not a very good economic system. We're not even talking like morally, certainly, but even on like the basis of like capitalism, there's a reason the North won. So the North was a much stronger economic powerhouse than the South because the political institutions in the South were so dominated by the planter class, they were basically able to stop any kind of serious industrialization in the South. So, okay, post-slavery, there is going to be industrialization in the South. Well, who gets to win in that system? The idea of the radical Republicans that would be the freed slaves, which makes a hell of a lot of sense to me, which is why one of the most tragic aspects of American history is that the Civil War, which in my opinion was the second American Revolution. It was like the fulfillment of a lot of these ideas that were fought for at the founding of this country. It's such a shame that it never was able to complete that revolutionary process on the economic and social level. It just meant that that planter class was pushed out. So you have this group of people, Southern industrialists and middle class members, who basically are able to take power. And they had a lot of tension with the old planter class because the planter class wanted to see their old systems of, aristocracy, of personal privilege restored. And they were agrarian, so they didn't like bigger cities and industrialization and the expansion of railroads. Where the redeemers and that old planter class did find a lot of common cause was in waging war against black people and waging war against poor whites. And even though there was a lot of fighting between those two groups in most circumstances, whenever you started to see political movements that were really trying to capture the spirit and the frustration and the devastation of poor working people and poor black people in the South, the planter class was right there with them, right? What does this have to do with today? Well, there was a lot of money that was up for grabs in the revitalization process, both private and federal, that was out there. And the redeemers basically took their position in governments and used that as a spoil system to basically up friends of theirs, people who were close to them, for private gain. Right? These were things that were like absolutely was necessary to industrialize the South. In my opinion, there's no question about that. But it was done in a very particular manner with the intention of enriching a very particular group of folks. And the way that Southern governments relate to public money has always been in this kind of spoil system where you reward people who are loyal to you, where you take money that is supposed to be used to revitalize and use it to somehow find a way to deliver it to folks. Like they did that in the 1880s. And you're seeing it right there when they take money from TANF and they're giving it to people like Brett Favre, somebody who certainly doesn't need any kind of public largesse. So it's really important, I think, to understand that people like Reeves are representative certainly of the decay that is the modern Republican Party, but are also representative of a very old school Southern political view of politics, where you find ways to take public money, where you create crises so that you can have people come in and overtake and privatize public goods like a water system, right? This is an old playbook in the South, and it is key to understanding, in my opinion, Southern politics over the past 140 years in this country, is that the government, despite all the love of the free market and the love of small government, it's always been a spoil system, right? And it's been that way since the radical Republicans were pushed out of office, and it's that way today. And it's not surprising, going back to what I was saying about Donald Trump, that Trump plays so well there because he's playing right into that historical game of in the South, right? That historical game where wealthy people are coming in and utilizing Southern political chaos that is created by the political class there, that is created by the owning class there for their own gain. It's a long ass tradition, and I think that it's worthwhile to understand that the racism and the white supremacy that is very much a part of Southern history and Southern politics always had an end game in sight, right? Which was preventing any kind of solidarity from working class people in the South, and also finding ways to use the government effectively as a piggy bank to enrich yourself and enrich your friends. And Southern governors know that shit very damn well, and they've been doing it since the 1880s, and they're doing it today. And we need to come up with political movements that can break this impasse that we're currently in, because it's not working for us, and it wasn't working for us in the past either.
Yeah, that post Civil War sort of I've been reading a lot about Custer, as I always do. George Armstrong Custer, Union cavalry general who, after the war, was pissing off Ulysses Grant. There was some corruption stuff, but also was a fucking like Democrat, basically. Like thought that, and there are certain parts of Custer as a Union general, brevet general, like the ranks were inflated during the war. But as a guy who did free actual slaves with military force, and also like recognizing, okay, these guys can fight a little bit too. Ultimately, he was supporting President Andrew Johnson and saying we need to get basically these freed black people back under control, back producing. Like there's a whole bunch of like letters of him and his wife talking about how like you just see him standing around, right? Like they should be making things. And there was a big boom for capitalism after the war for like almost
a huge
a decade.
boom. It was a great place to make your money. I mean, I think that, and this is like the dangerous game that the Democrats were able to play, because one, by their own design, right? It's not like, oh, this just happened. They were doing this on purpose to create this crisis.
Yeah.
But the South was economically devastated, and particularly for the working people who didn't benefit from the slave system, and certainly formerly enslaved people. It was very easy for kind of for these Southern politicians to say like, oh, well, you notice the big thing that's changed here is we've gotten rid of slavery here, and now you're supposed to be of equal standing to somebody who you're able to look down upon. They were able to make a lot of political hay out of that for a long time. And as I try to talk about a lot on this program, there were plenty of moments of resistance and attempts to try to break that situation. But it's really important to understand that post-Civil War, the South was a free-for-all, and a lot of people made a shitload of money. And I think that a lot of people don't have that kind of historical understanding to get that, like the politics that we have today in the South are very much outcomes of that failed project of Reconstruction. Again, a lot of it purposeful and by design. But it is a historical legacy that we're still sitting with today. And like, you still see it. Like the South is the poorest area of the country. There's mass disinvestment, and it was purposeful to prop up a few boys who are able to make a shitload of money, predominantly on the railroads, then by extracting natural resources from the South to be manufactured in the Northeast, right? So I want to do a hell of a lot more on this. We did this today just because I was seeing Reeves, and I just could not resist the kind of historical parallels to what he's doing there right now to what a lot of these redeemers did in the South after the Civil War. So we'll do a lot more on this in the near future, maybe even as a part of a new project that Matt and I might be launching soon. Anyways, until then, we have this really awesome interview talking about Trump and the FBI raid there. And almost immediately after that, we'll be jumping on the post game. Matt's got some fun sound. We'll be hanging out, taking y'all's calls, your questions, and your IMs. You get access to that at patreon.com/leftreckoning. One last plug. Don't forget, we got all of our hats and shirts and stuff like that up on leftreckoning.com/store. So stick around for this interview and then join us in the post game at patreon.com/leftreckoning. See y'all in a little bit.
Oh, also our show at the Telegram Ballroom with This is Revolution and Ben Burgess. Go buy some tickets if you're in LA. Come out and see us. I'm going to be booking my hotel probably in the next few days.
Let me know where you're staying.
Yeah, I need to figure that out actually. I need some advice.
And anyways, also just there's a little jump in here because Charles was very gracious with us. We recorded this last week, but there was some new news in the Trump investigation. So he's very gracious to record a follow-up with us. So that's all in there. We will see y'all there. Yeah. And just real quick, October 23rd in Los Angeles at the Telegram Ballroom. Sorry for interrupting you, man.
That's right. Yeah, October 23rd. And Charles is at ugarls on Twitter, a guy who I've honestly probably been following. There's a whole bunch of people I started following like 2015, 2016, but I think there's like a Deadspin cohort of people who still like I dig their work, who I followed like in 2012. I think Charles is one of those. Very funny guy on Twitter. So follow him at UGARLES. And here's our conversation with him. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, man. How you doing?
I'm doing well. It's Friday. We're here talking to a legal expert about the jeopardy Donald Trump is in. We have Charles Starr at UGarls. You know him from the Hostile Witness podcast. Also, All Lawyers Are Bad. It's All Lawyers Are Bad series,
Bastards.
Right? Bastards. Okay. I always thought of the bad, but Bastards I think is the correct one. And of the Mike Dick podcast, which I think is the greatest podcast name probably in the history of podcasts.
As soon as someone said it, I think the first person who said it was was Mike, who's at Ancient Care Lord. Who was on a couple of episodes, and he said it, but he spelled it Mike, and I was like, no, give it a C, and it's fucking gold.
Yeah,
which is like our tagline was America's best named legal podcast, like because it was like one of those things where like I heard it and I'm like, that's amazing. I'll never do anything that pure in my life again.
Today we are going to talk about the Trump raid, and we're doing this in the wake of Dark Brandon's ascendance to the high throne of communist fascism last night with his he appeared
in red, and you know that just means that the killings are about to begin.
There are people that are actually saying
I
that.
I know. I want to make them sleep poorly.
But I want to talk about a historic event that happened recently and contextualize it for both myself and our audience. The Trump raid, the Mar-a-Lago raid, the MAL raid, as I forget, Michael Knowles calls it.
Yeah. Well, you only have 280 characters. I've
there you
MAL myself.
What was the Trump raid?
Okay, so it's funny because it's impossible to answer the question without like a ton of. This is great. The camera cutoff is amazing. You don't see my Italian hands. Not that I'm Italian, but I got them going on in space under the camera. But so when your term ends as president, the archives take everything, right? Everything is a government record, and while you get it, you get it back if it's not anything that they need to hold on to. They have to catalog everything. I assume in 2022 they digitize everything and they have like their comprehensive record. But Trump talks all the time about how Obama has 33 million records because he's doing the Obama presidential library. But the archives have already categorized all of it, right? He has it, but everyone knows he has it and they know exactly what he has. So the archives, as a matter of federal law, in the wake of Nixon, passed statutes that affirmatively, the Presidential Records Act affirmatively states that everything created by or reviewed by the president or the presidential administration is a government record, not a personal record, because Nixon tried to claim that it was literally his. And so he could take the tapes and he could take the documents and he could, fuck off back to Chula Vista and no one could touch him. And so the Congress passed a law in the wake of Nixon, which said that's not true. They're all government records. You can't keep them. They're not private. And so when Trump's presidency ended, he packed up everything. This is like a little loose, but roughly true. He packed up everything. The trucks went down to Florida, and he had all the stuff with him in Florida. And the archives were like, okay, we're missing a lot of stuff. You just packed up the office. Give us back the documents. And so they fight for a year over whether executive privilege covers it and whether they have to. And then in January of 2022, they send back, and you see this talked about all the time, 15 boxes of documents. They said, here you go. Here are the presidential records, and they sent back 15 boxes of documents. And in those boxes of documents, sorry, I have my notes here on the side for the details. They go through all of them, right? The archivists go through everything, and they spot 184 documents with classification markings, ranging from classified all the way to like top secret, sensitive, compartmentalized, and stuff relating to weapons and nuclear and the whole whatever. There are all of these different markings. I don't, it's like, an eye chart to me, because I don't know literally what they mean, because they're all abbreviated, but other people have been tweeting about them. And this is like roughly what it is, but it's classified, it's top secret, it's specific categories of top secret. Right. And so they contact the FBI, and they're like, there are almost 200 documents at a country club in Florida that the former president, is not supposed to have. And so the FBI opens a criminal investigation, and the DOJ contacts Trump's representatives, and they say, what's going on here? You had 200 classified documents. Do you have anything else? We're pretty sure you do, because there are things that we expected to be either left behind or in this disclosure that we know you haven't given back, right? Like, I don't remember if it was at the beginning or later, but the correspondence with Kim Jong-un wasn't in there. Right, the perfect letter or whatever. They didn't have it, and that's like an important, federal record, national security document, confidential, whole whatever. Like, we've never seen that letter, right? There's a reason why that was never released, and it's because it's like, confidential diplomatic communications. And so they're like, you have to give us back the other stuff. The DOJ is like, give us more stuff. And eventually after going back and forth, they issue a subpoena. Or they say, sorry, it's so funny. The sequence is the National Archives are like, we want to let the FBI look at this stuff, the Department of Justice. We want them to review these documents. And they fight for 4 months over executive privilege and other disputes. But eventually the archives are like, we think all of your objections are invalid, and we're turning them over to the Justice Department because we don't think you have made a valid legal claim. And they do. And then the DOJ gets a subpoena because they think there's more, right? So now Trump has to respond to the subpoena, and he responds to the subpoena by inviting representatives of the government to come to Mar-a-Lago for an in-person exchange of the additional classified marked materials that his team has uncovered after an allegedly thorough search, right? They said everything classified is going to be in the storage room. We went by hand through everything in the storage room, and they hand them one like Redwell of documents. I don't know if you know what a Redwell is. They're those red manila, flap over the top documents, which they taped up like double. So, like no one improper can look at it to like do a sort of pantomime of protocol. And so they give them this thing, and that had 38 documents in it. Right. And they're like, that's everything. And one of Trump's attorneys wrote an affidavit. And we know, I guess, from other context, even though it's redacted in the filings here, apparently this was Christina Bobb, who's one of Trump's like PR people / attorneys. She's like the public face is all I mean.
Okay, right.
She goes on the news. Like, I didn't mean that as nicely as it came out, but she's like someone who goes in front of the cameras and is his like official spokesman, but she's also counsel. And so she signs the affidavit, which says we went through this by hand, and this is everything. There's nothing else. And of course, they know that's not true, because still there are things missing. And so at that point, they write up an affidavit, and that was released in redacted form last week. And they go to the magistrate judge in Florida, in the Southern District of Florida, and they're like, we need a warrant. Like, we actually have to search his place because we have already seen evidence of over 200 classified plus documents in his house. We have interviewed his staff. We have interviewed his house staff. We have reviewed the security tapes from Mar-a-Lago, and all of the witness testimony is that people go in and out of the room, and the security tapes show people going in and out of the room and moving boxes around. So we have reason to believe that they've been dishonest with us and that there will be more stuff if we go and look. And so they get the warrant and then they raid the place, right? They wait till he's not there so they don't have to taser the former president of the United States. And they go in and they search the place, right? The warrant gives them access to all of Mar-a-Lago except for currently occupied guest rooms, right? You know, some banker from Wisconsin who pays $200,000 a year to play golf at Mar-a-Lago and is staying for the weekend. They didn't search his room, but anything else, offices, empty rooms, Trump's personal office, at the residence, they searched all of that, including the storage room. And they found over 100 more classified documents stored with non-classified documents. Like, I tweeted this out today, but I had made it, like, I mean, I didn't make the joke completely out of my head. It was in the affidavit too, but they said that in the initial 15 boxes, there were classified documents stored with like newspapers and magazines and blah, blah, blah. So I made some joke about him like stuffing the nuclear codes in an old copy of Us Weekly. Yeah. And if you read the inventory, because they released the search inventory today, there are boxes which are like, you know, 300 magazines and 45 confidential documents.
I don't know, like, I think it's like worth re-upping just for folks. Like, as much as I would like to think that Trump is just feeling very sentimental and he wants to, like, you know, hold on to these to remember fond memories. I mean, you know, what likely was being held there was some pretty serious stuff that you don't just want to be stored next to a U.S. weekly magazine.
Yeah, I mean, it's really funny as a leftist to like have this conversation because you end up seeming like you're like kissing the ass of like the Justice Department and the FBI. And like, but it's weird that when you, they may be irredeemable institutions, but in their idealized version, they like have a role in national security and the protection of, you know, certain important data and, you know, like people who like respond to like decarceration as if it means you like crime and all of these sort of dumb things. But it's like there is a need for justice. There is it like, and so the fact of the raid makes a lot of sense in the context of, you know, even putting aside if the government overclassifies stuff and putting aside if the government is like shady in a million ways, some of them aren't shady. And we don't want like nuclear proliferation. Not that we know that it's, you know what I mean? Like in the extreme scenario of it, there is a reason why diplomatic channels are done in private for, you know, international comedy and all of that, right? So you can have like a basic respect for the interplay of government and politics to not want this lunatic stuffing shit in his bag because he thinks it's cool. And that's not even getting into the kind of more kind of woolly theories about if he's like overtly malign and turning it over to, you know, Saudi Arabia or Russia or any of like all of that shit is like not my interest. Like, I don't disclaim that it's impossible. Like, I think it's possible. I just I just consider it really hairy, wild speculation to think that that's what's going on, and I think it's a waste of my time to get myself all hot and bothered over that. Even if it's true, prove it to me before I spend a lot of time ranting about it. Right. And this is coming from someone who thought the Mueller report showed fairly convincingly that Russia was at least trying to influence him and some of his comrades, some of his, collaborators, Bannon and Eric Prince and Manafort, were like knee deep in the muck with Russia, whether or not he personally was, and whether you could tie it to him. So it's like, I don't think Russiagate was a hoax. I think the most extreme version of it is probably a little cinematic, but there was there, and there was at least reason to investigate a lot of it, because there was smoke even in places where there might not have been fire, right? But I don't have to go that far. I do know that he was like holding stuff that he shouldn't have had, and he thinks it's cool to show that shit to people.
Yeah, I think that's the principle. Like, I mean, putting this in the context of Nixon explains a lot, because Nixon had to fork over the tapes that he was recording of everybody, and it's not an unreasonable procedure that those went through. They're scrubbed. I used to listen to them as a hobby. They're scrubbed of anything remotely personal, like probably generously so. Yeah. But that's a process to get this stuff into the sort of public sphere, because it belongs to all of us, and that's the principle that's being throttled here. And it's funny, I've seen certain people.
So it's interesting because it get like some of the back and forth gets a little confusing, because it is true that all of the documents are government documents, and so Trump doesn't have a right to them, right? But they didn't get the warrant on those grounds. Right? Because the Presidential Records Act itself does not have an enforcement mechanism. You're kind of just subject to the fact that you have to argue with the guy until he relents. No other presidents had a problem with this, but he did, right? He just took the stuff and he Molen-labed a bunch of white papers, right? And so he took this stuff, and they wouldn't have necessarily been able to get it by warrant, except that he also took classified stuff. And so that's how they got the warrant. They got him under 3 statutes, right? 18 U.S.C. 1519 is obstruction for taking records. 18 U.S.C. 2071 is taking the documents themselves, right? Like taking government records, and there's some narrowing of it, but that's basically what it is. And then 18 U.S.C. 793 is an even more specific version of 2071, which applies to like national defense documents, right? So that's how they anchored the warrant to search his property. As they said, he violated these criminal statutes based on what he already gave back to us. We have reason to believe he violated them. And based on the other evidence we've gathered, we have reason to believe he is still in possession of documents that violate these statutes. And so we're going to go in and we're going to take everything that has that document. And under the terms of the warrant, they also get to take everything stored with those documents, right? The reason why they take the pile of Us Weeklies is because it was in a box with a top secret document. And the reason you take the whole box, in part because it's just easier to cart away a box, but as a legal theory, what the government said in their response to his motion was, you prove how sloppy he is by showing how he stored this stuff. It was in an unsecure room in a box with a bunch of random garbage. Like, this is not how someone taking the confidentiality of classified material seriously treats things. And so they packed up the whole drawer. That's how they got his passports. They packed up the whole drawer where there was one document. They packed up these whole boxes. And so they explain why they're allowed to take all this stuff. And then when you see the inventory, they are now in possession of stuff that they wouldn't have found super easy to get back, of literally thousands of documents that belong to the National Archives because they were in boxes with the confidential stuff.
And like, not to be too sparkly eyed about all of this, you know,
Right.
but on the level of like, you know, equality under the law, obviously the president does like enjoy tremendous privileges. You know, privately, I was talking to some, you know, military friends, government friends, and they said when they saw the photographs, like it literally gave them a panic attack just because like being around those documents before, it always made them so nervous that if they fuck up, you know, their life could be really ruined forever, you know, and like this is how serious people in that world take it because they know that the hammer can come down on you. And, you know, apart from the seriousness of like him maybe using it for something else, it's literally is just like, if you have possession of these kind of things, there's a responsibility that is inherent there about how you're, you know, protecting classified.
And you certainly know it's part of the job, right? Like, even if you think it's unserious, right? Like, even if you don't believe in speeding laws, if you do 100, you're pretty aware you're going to get pulled over, right? You at least should have in the back of your mind that you might, even if you're like the most extreme libertarian, the idea that you actually will get pulled over for it should cross your mind. You should have a healthy fear of that because of the danger you are putting other people in, right? And so, I mean, and with respect to like seeing those documents, which by the way is very funny, that the thing that he's angry about is that it made him look like a slob, right? Trump, he's like, they showed the documents piled on the floor, and that's not what I do, which is, of course, the FBI or the DOJ never even said that that's what it was, right? Yeah. They spread it out like the way I describe it is they spread it out like the way like a local police department stacks the guns and drugs on a table to show what they got out of the trap house, right? That's what that was. This is a photo of like all of the confidential stuff so that we can have a record of where we recovered it and when and how much was in this box. And it's just sort of part of their cataloging. And they anonymized everything except for the confidentiality markings. And then he made it seem like they were trying to make him look like a slob instead of a guy who had dozens of these things packed next to his framed Time magazine covers. Right?
Very unfair. Very unfair.
Very, very unfair to him. But then, you know, all day today, people have been tweeting photos of his office, which are hilariously messy. Like, there's shit stacked everywhere in his pre-White House office. So it's like, I mean, whatever.
If he was a super tidy guy, I would be a little bit upset with myself at, you know, how bad. I want to play this clip of Bill Barr from this interview and then ask you about who is representing Trump.
I think it would, you know, at this stage, since they've already gone through the documents, I think it's a waste of time.
Attorney General Barr, we've seen that famous photo of all of the top secret /SCI materials arrayed on the floor in President Trump's office there at Mar-a-Lago.
There it is.
He claims that he had a standing order to declassify anything that he took out of the White House when he left in January of 2021. Is there any legitimate reason for those materials to be in the former president's possession?
No, I can't think of a legitimate reason why they could be taken out of the government, away from the government, if they're classified. I frankly am skeptical of this claim that I declassified everything, you know, because frankly, I think it's highly improbable. And second, if in fact he sort of stood over scores of boxes, not really knowing what was in them, and said, I hereby declassify everything in here, that would be such an abuse. And show such recklessness that it's almost worse than taking the documents.
To that point, though, there's some questions over the
It's such a kill shot.
And Trump has responded. He said on True Social an hour ago, Bill Barr had, quote, no guts and got, quote, no glory. He was a weak and pathetic rhino who was so afraid of being impeached that he became a captive to the radical left Democrats. Please, please, please don't impeach me, he supposedly said. Barr never fought the way he should have for election integrity and so much else. He started off okay as AG, but faded fast. I like he's talking about like a racehorse.
Yeah.
Didn't have courage or stamina.
They tested his urine after.
Exactly. He didn't have courage or stamina. People like that will never make America great again. So that's
There you
one.
go.
There's several
Yeah.
tweets. Trump's on, you know.
And so that's the first half of Barr, which is like, it's just such a brutal thing to say, where he's like, they keep arguing that it's declassified, but if that's true, that's worse than anything else he did, right? Like, just right off the top, if he was declassifying, like, as a matter of course, things that were otherwise supposed to be top secret, he's insane and a menace. Right. And then he goes on to argue, I think he goes on to argue that, you know, the Justice Department has the better of everything in the argument.
They're getting jerked around, he said, I think.
Yeah. He did. Like, this is, you know, I gave you the timeline before of the back and forth. And he basically is like, once you give them an affidavit that says you've given them everything, and they know it to be untrue, what do you mean a second subpoena? Like, they've already asserted, like, under oath that there's nothing else. A second subpoena is like the I strenuously object from a few good men. Like, it doesn't mean anymore, right? They're just going to respond to it, see prior affidavit. Or if you do turn some stuff over, then you have to sort of explain why you gave them the first affidavit, right? So they get the warrant, they go search, and I mean, one of the best lines in the DOJ is like brutal, and it really is. It's like it picks, you know, the Trump position to shreds all the way through. One of the things they said is our agents found in 2 hours in the storage room twice as many documents as they found in like 2 months of delays, you know, because they kept asking for extensions. And so they're like, we found, you know, twice as much. We found 74 documents in the storage room alone where you said you had gone by hand through this stuff. And this is what the documents looked like. It's not like a handwritten C in the corner or something. It's got these bright colored cover pages, which say top secret in 42-point font. You know, like, you couldn't have missed this if you're being serious, you know? And so that's what they did. And, you know, the last Trump brief was better than the first one, but all of them are, you know, long on histrionics and short on law. Right? They keep yelling about how abused he is and how the DOJ is unfair and this is unprecedented, but they cite cases which are irrelevant, right? They cite cases about Clinton's executive privilege when Clinton was literally still the president, you know? And so it's like, that doesn't count for you. You're actually not the president, you know?
Yeah.
And they want the special master for attorney-client privilege. And then all of the cases they cite are like the Michael Cohen case or the Rudy Giuliani case, and there were special masters in both of those, and a few other cases. But in all of those cases, the police or the FBI or whoever was raiding a law office. And the thing about raiding a law office is they have other clients. And so you don't want the police rummaging through the attorney-client files, especially of people who aren't implicated in what you're looking at in the first place. So you get a special master there. They gave one of the examples where they were like 97% of the material in this law office raid wasn't relevant to the search. And so the filter team pulled all of that out. So that's when you get a special master. You don't get a special master just because you used to be the president and you're upset at something.
Yeah, I want the specialist master that has ever been mastered. What do you make of Trump's representation?
Well, I mean, there are varying degrees, right? Here are the 4 people that I know about. There are 2 more whose names I can think of. Lindsay Halligan is like, you know, she's young and pretty, and she's the kind of person you want to be a spokesman, like Christina Bobb is. She doesn't seem to have a ton of background. She's got less than fewer than 10 years of practice. And nothing that I found seemed super impressive. On the Florida bar site, her email address is outlook.com. So she doesn't have like a business address that it goes to. Evan Corcoran is an ex-prosecutor who is now in private practice, I think in the Maryland area. And so he's got, some credentials. But he also, it's very weird to have him on the briefs because he's also potentially a witness. Like he was involved in a lot of the correspondence with the DOJ, right? Like he made representations. He spoke to them during this. So it's not hugely surprising that he's involved, but it's a little weird, right? Because it may get to a point where he ends up having to be interviewed about this stuff. And then the third, up until a couple of days ago, was Jim Trusty, who was a DC attorney. He was in the DOJ for almost 30 years. He was pretty high up in the DOJ. So my guess is he's got real chops. I mean, this is hack work, but he doesn't have much to work with. There's really no precedent that gives Trump the right to do this. So he's like, starting with not a lot. And then the guy who was added recently and who I think did oral argument yesterday on this motion is Christopher Kise, who is the former Solicitor General of Florida, and he was a prosecutor. And so he has climbed high enough that he's probably not dumb, like he is probably the guy, like one of the guys you want to put your best foot forward. I mean, he's not as experienced probably as Trusty, but he was high up in the Florida government, probably not a dummy. Like some of the other people seem like, not as a Kayleigh McEnany back in the day. He was, had no experience and was a hack. And Christina Bobb doesn't seem to have much of a history. Neither do I. I mean, pot kettle, whatever. But, I've been around for a long time, but my resume is not impressive. And then there's one more whose name I don't remember. Hababa or something like that, who represented Trump in the New York Attorney General investigation. And she went on Fox News and almost certainly incriminated herself because she said she went by hand, like she submitted an affidavit in New York saying she went through the entire storage room by hand, and she does not have security clearances. So if that's true, she was not allowed to see any of those documents. And it only proves how slack Trump was in securing them, right? That a person that knowing that there were, or should have known that there were classified documents in there, and he let someone without security clearance do the work to respond to Tish James's subpoena, which is unimpressive.
What would you respond to somebody who said, Hillary should have also been raided?
For what?
Well,
in all seriousness, right? Thing. I mean, the answer is for what? I mean, and look, I am one of the people on the left who very early on thought that Hillary was fucking up the email stuff because it is bad, right? Her motives were bad. She wanted more control over documents that should have been in the government control, right? Though it seems much more obvious that it was for sort of personal PR damage control-y sort of reasons than, anything much more than that. She wasn't, she's an enemy of the left, I guess, but she's not an enemy of the state, And so what she did goes back to Bill's entire suspicion of everything and was bad. She shouldn't have done it. There's literally no reason to have had a private server for any of this stuff. But there's also no reason that she got rid of any sensitive information. And so she dug her own grave on that stuff, but there's not really any evidence that she should have been raided. Right? I don't know that there was anything that wasn't somewhere else, right? Like the government systems, I think, were redundant. I don't know that the archives have complained that they think they're missing anything, you know?
Right.
So like it's like what she did was wrong, but I don't think it's analogous.
And I think that's why, or partially why, I think that Trump is comparing himself to Obama in this instance and not Hillary. And also probably...
Oh, no, he compares himself to Hillary because Hillary can't make up for it. Like they're gone. Right. She wiped the drives or whatever, though he keeps implying that they didn't turn stuff over, but they actually turned over most of the servers. Just some of the servers have been wiped. And I don't know. It's all fucking in the weeds, but it's like Hillary dug her own grave, but the Obama stuff is just nonsense. His records are in the Obama presidential library. The archives know exactly where they are.
He still goes on about Hillary. I haven't seen that so much because I would figure that would be against his case. He's also saying lock her up. So it's like, if we're going to take this super seriously, buddy, like you signed yourself up for it.
Oh yeah. He's not a big believer in the hubris theory of accusations.
Right. Well, I think that really covers it. Unless David, you have any questions? Is there any other parts of this you think are worth emphasizing?
Let me take a quick peek through my notes, but I don't really think so.
Is he going to wriggle out of this? I mean, there's the Jesse Farrar tweet of Trump is really
nevertheless.
Yeah. And then Trump easily wriggles out of it, and well, nevertheless.
Right. No, I don't think so. I mean, I will say I'm going to I'll probably go deeper in the weeds when I'm talking, because inshallah, I will be recording with my hostile witness buddies next Friday, and I'll try to turn that around, and we'll probably get more in the weeds of the documents themselves instead of the sort of broader, and I hope very easily accessible way of explaining all of this stuff. I sort of try to speak English as much as I can. But I don't think I have anything else. The other thing that we're going to talk about when we record, our plan is to go into a time capsule and talk about the latest twists and turns in the Mueller report, where, the background memoranda that allowed Barr to claim that, he decided that Trump did not commit obstruction, which, they had been shielding from FOIA release for 3 years. The judge finally was like, no, those are going to be public, and those came out. So talking about that fight and the content of those memoranda is what, another thing that we're going to cover.
All right, we are back with a Left Reckoning update with Charles Starr. Charles, a special master has been named.
Well, not named yet, but there will be one named. Yeah, the judge in Florida, Judge Cannon, issued an order in response from the clown court. Trump's people made this really sort of haphazard claim to a special master. I think this is being tacked on to what I just said. So anyone watching this, I suppose, knows already. But right, so Trump makes a crazy claim. The Department of Justice shreds it. Trump files a marginally better response. There is an oral argument that was open to the public, but no one was allowed to live tweet it, and they didn't put it on the air. So everything I have about it is secondhand. But all of the contemporaneous accounts were, holy shit, she's really going to do this. And put a special master. Took a couple of days for her to issue her opinion, and that's exactly what she did. So she has now said that the national security review of the documents can go forward. She's not getting in the way of that, right? Anything that was already turned over to the Intelligence Review Committee or board or whatever they call their intra-agency national security people are still doing that. But with respect to the criminal investigation that the subpoena was issued under and the grand jury that this is potentially, to be provided to, all of that, she has issued an injunction stopping the entire government from proceeding with the document. So it's frozen until the special master comes in. I've seen other people say that that's beyond her jurisdiction. It gets a little more in the weeds that I am aware of about the injunctive authority of district courts. People are saying, like, just because of sovereign immunity, you can't enjoin the entire United States government. You may be able to enjoin agencies or individuals or whatever, but the breadth of this is crazy, but so is the reasoning, right? There are no, what she wrote to justify this special master is essentially a bespoke rule for a former president of the United States, right? Because nothing else makes sense, right? Like, you're supposed to have irreparable injury as one, and she goes out of her way to say that the federal government has not treated him unfairly, right? She's like, prong one, has it been prejudicial? No, right? But she's like, is the harm irreparable? And she ties it entirely to, like, his reputation as this defending, which is literally every defendant. Every defendant has reputational harm when they're being investigated for something like this. She says that, some of the government admits that some of, personal materials and like some medical records and stuff have been swept up. And so that is irreparable harm. But he hasn't even argued that any of the personal material is critical and needs to be returned immediately. She is like on her own, unless it all came out in the hearing, but there is no medical record sitting in a desk at Donald Trump's office that isn't duplicated somewhere else, right? So there's no irreparable harm to the government keeping that copy. There's no financial record that he has the only version of. And so the definition of irreparable harm is being stretched way beyond any conceivable meaning. And it's just like that over and over and over again. She doesn't discuss at all the jerking around that Trump's people did. She doesn't discuss at all the actual relevant precedent with Nixon and, his claims to own everything. Where she does address it, she fudges. She's like, well, arguably a former president has, executive, can invoke executive privilege. But Nixon was doing it against Congress, not to the next president. He was literally the president at the time. He wasn't even an ex-president. He had the highest level of executive privilege that you could have. And the Supreme Court said no, right? You have to turn it over to a different body, right? And here, Trump is claiming it against the current executive, like everything is fudged. And every bit of Trump's behavior, she bends over as far backward as she can.
So
I just want to say real quick, David, sorry, some more frivolous points, but I have to point out, like, Eileen Cannon, it does sound like a Thomas Pynchon character. And also, she is a decade younger than the Nixon president born in 1981, in case
let's not talk about it too much. She's also a decade younger than I am. And she's a federal judge in Florida. She is it ticks, and she ticks all the boxes, right? She was Federalist Society at Michigan. She is people who are like, she was born in Colombia, but she was born in Colombia after her parents fled Cuba. So she has gone from, so I'm sure she is in like the sort of conservative Florida Cuban community, and true believer. She was confirmed after the election, right? When McConnell was shoving all of the nominees through between November and January. So like all of the indications that she's a hack. Apparently she wrote like anti-vaxxy kind of opinions early in the pandemic, giving people broad rights. And so she's playing the role that everyone expected, right? The people who thought the worst of it at the beginning. And I try not to. I don't know. I feel like there's some responsibility not to always be like, the very obvious red flag. It doesn't always mean everything, but it did here. Like, there's no getting around it. She issued exactly the opinion that she thought she would. I mean, I tweeted about this, but there's like a footnote on attorney-client privilege, right? And, I think I explained how the privilege team works, right? They whip through everything. They segregate out everything they think is privileged, and they don't give it to the trial team. And they have a separate proceeding before the judge to figure out what is and isn't privileged, right? There were 2 documents, and she mentions this, 2 documents slipped through the filter team to the trial team. And when the trial team was going through the material, they go, I think these 2 documents are privileged, and they give them back, right? You would think that would be an indication of good faith in the system working, but it instead gets whipsawed into proof that the taint team doesn't work as designed, because 2 documents slipped through, and we don't know how much those 2 documents were read. We don't know if the people who read them were kicked off the team. Like all of these things that in a normal course wouldn't even be questions, right? An inadvertent disclosure like that, where someone recognizes it on it may not even be privileged. It's just arguably privileged and has to go through the process. And, you can either put the best face on it and say that the DOJ is acting responsibly and filtering things back to the taint team if the taint team makes a mistake, or you can say this is just proof that none of this works and you need a special master, and she chose path 2.
So, I mean, obviously, very dubious decision, and just assuming that it's not challenged in some form or another. I mean, could you just explain to folks, what this really means for the timeline here?
Well, it's hard to figure out exactly what the timeline is. I mean, the first part of the timeline is that she gave both sides 4 days to submit special master names and a protocol for the special master's review, which will probably include a timeline. Both sides, at least in the initial, in their initial filings, wanted to make sure that they said it was a requirement that the special master has to have top secret clearance, because the special master is going to have to review this stuff. So if they don't have clearance, they can't do it. Both sides agreed, and I don't think the judge will disagree. That substantially limits the special master pool, I think. I don't know that federal judges automatically get that clearance the way the president does. It very often is the case that in top secret, like defense department cases, they file things under seal, and they don't even file them under seal. They submit affidavits that are like, even you can't see this. And so I don't know how courts handle that. I just know that it has happened. I remember a very specific case, which was like a tort case where a pilot was killed and they wouldn't even let the judge see like the airplane design documents and stuff like that. So that's number 1 is 4 days. And then that will probably mean appointing a special master very quickly. I can't imagine that either side wouldn't vet the people for availability before putting their name on this list. Other than that, the 2 relevant timelines are either an appeal timeline, which is, I'm sure that if they go to the 11th Circuit, they would ask for it to be expedited. But the 11th Circuit can say yes or no to that, right? It's unlikely that they would say no. They've slow rolled. Courts all over have slow rolled other things that you would think they would want to move fast. But, they have the discretion. They could slow roll it. He has appointed 6 of the 11 non-senior judges on that court. Who knows what the panel would be? But like there are like multiple steps. It could go to a 3-judge panel who happen to all be Democrats, reversing whatever bias, and they snap, expedite it, and reverse. If he asks it to go to the en banc court, we then have 6 of 11 who are Trump appointees, not even Republican appointees, Trump appointees. He really stacked this court. And so, maybe what percentage of them are hacks and what percentage of them actually give a shit about actual executive privilege and, discovery operations. I don't know. And then, of course, there's the Supreme Court, which is always a fucking mixed bag of weirdness on partisan issues. Like they weren't terrible generally on the absolute dumbest election stuff, but they've been pretty vigorously dumb on other partisan stuff. So who knows? So that's one track of the timeline. The second track, if they actually just decide not to appeal because the appellate courts are a crapshoot, is just the review itself, and the Trump people are just going to throw as much sand in the gears as they can. Right? It's 11,000 documents, which is nothing. Right. The special master, let's be clear. I do not think that there is a chance that a retired federal judge is going to hand by hand go through 11,000 documents. The special master, I'm sure, will have a staff who are also cleared to review the documents and whatever. 11,000 documents is nothing. Right. Yeah. They could really fly through that. I mean, the government did. Right. The government had all of this review done in just a couple of weeks after the seizure, because they threw a lot of bodies at it. And I am sure, would ask the same to happen here. But they are going to fight every document at every level and slow it down as much as possible. So the answer is no one knows how long this is going to take, right? They want it to be as laborious and slow as possible. And so that's what they're going to do. And if Cannon is going to let them do it, then Cannon is going to let them do it.
And so just to underline, this is quite a mockery of justice. Like that the Trump folks are sort of calling foul on all these administrative procedural things in the context of them flaunting sort of national archives stuff. It's ludicrous from any angle you look at it.
And it doesn't look like in any way the Justice Department did anything remotely wrong, right? They waited after a year of back and forth with a not particularly honest interlocutor, right? At each step, Trump kept screwing them and lying in different ways. Like another interesting thing I saw is just to even respond to the judge's order, right? The DOJ had to ask the judge supervising a grand jury in the District of Columbia for permission to make certain statements about the discovery, the negotiations, because they otherwise would have been confidential grand jury materials. And one of the things they said is, our subpoena said we want all documents that fit these criteria under Trump or the Trump organization's custody, or the transition, or whatever terms they used, under their custody and control. And when they wrote back to us, they said, we searched Mar-a-Lago and everything is in the storage room. And they're like, that's not the only relevant location, right? They could have searched Bedminster. They could have searched Trump Tower. The subpoena is not limited to his residence in Mar-a-Lago. Our search warrant was for there, because you have to do those location specific. Like if they wanted to go into Bedminster, they'd have to go to the District of New Jersey. If they wanted to go to Trump Tower, they'd have to go to the Southern District of New York and have subpoenas issued there to search those premises. The first one they got, probably because their information was he took everything home to Mar-a-Lago, or at least most of it. They got that subpoena where they thought most of it was. They got a magistrate to sign the subpoena. They took what they were entitled to under the subpoena, and they went through it as fast as possible to move through. Like, obviously, their main interest is their own prosecution, but it also gets his private stuff back as soon as possible if he's entitled to it, right? They gave him the passports as like a nice gesture, even though they said they didn't have to, whatever, right? It's impossible to read this and think that Trump is the aggrieved one, unless you actually buy the argument that it's your job as a federal judge to like hose down the MAGA morons who are like claiming that they're going to riot if their God King gets in any trouble, right? And this, like, to the extent that she thinks it's her role to turn down the heat on this stuff, and she definitely implies it, right? It was a big argument that Trump's people made, and how mad they made it by implication, but they're like, people are very upset by this. And, this is very, and she kind of buys into that a little. And it's not the judicial role. It's not a good way to judge the merits of a request for a special master. And it ends up treating this guy differently because his stands are so insane.
Yeah. Well, Charles, thank you so much for joining us again on this update. Hopefully it doesn't change too much in the couple hours between runtime. But give your plugs one more time for folks.
Sure. I think in between when we recorded and now, the latest episode of A Lab series did come out. It is, I'm not on it, but Andy and Tarek, Allah Liker and White Privilege, went back and interviewed a guy who they sideswiped in episode 8. He wasn't even the main character of that episode, but he was a colleague of the main character of that episode who they kicked around a little because he's a character. And he ended up suing them. And as part of the settlement for the suit, they brought him on to episode 27 to let him tell his story. And it's kind of a fascinating document. And so I recommend you listen to the end of 8 first, which he probably considers horrible, but it provides context. And then you can listen to episode 27 and you really sort of get an idea of who he is and what the litigation was. And I think it's kind of crazy. And so that's the big one. I've got an episode I'm recording on this with my hostile witness friends, Eric Michael and Patrick Cosmos on Twitter. Patrick Cosmos's Twitter is actually @veryimportant. But those two guys and I are going to record an episode about this and about the old Bill Barr stuff regarding the Mueller report. And hopefully I'll get that out early next week, I think.
Awesome. Thanks, Charles.
Thank you, guys.
Appreciate Charles coming back to update us like that.
Absolutely. Damn, man, you got to get that ticker on the whole show.
I just looked at that. Isn't that nice?
Learning process. No, that was really great. Charles is very insightful. And I said to him after, it's like, I appreciate having somebody like him to take us through that, because that can be sometimes a little technical and you get lost, but he does a great job at sort of breaking it down for everybody.
Yep. Yeah, you need someone who simultaneously like probably studied law, but also like mainly likes to like shit post. That's like the combination of like, the wavelength to like get people to tune in.
Well, yeah, we're going to jump over the post game and, just give us like 5 minutes or so. Usually it takes a little bit longer, but we're ready to go. So get us over there at patreon.com/leftreckoning. Leave us a voicemail at 1-940-289-7234. 940-289-7234. we would love to hear from y'all. So appreciate everybody for tuning in, and join us in the post game in just a couple minutes. And we'll see everybody Griscom stream this Thursday, and another cross stream with our friends at This Is Revolution on Thursday night as well. So see all of y'all around.
Peace.